Thank you for joining us for another video with the Anselm Institute in our series on virtue. And we have been talking about virtue, what a virtue is, what a habit is. We've talked about the cardinal virtues, infused virtue and acquired virtue. We talked about the theological virtues. What we're going to be talking about today are the opposite of virtues. We're talking about vices. And Ryan, would you lead us into, could just start maybe with the initial question of what is a vice?
Yeah, thanks. So those who are watching the videos, there's an earlier video that we have called What is Virtue, which lays some of the background, some of the groundwork, and goes into more detail. I'll give a very brief summary of that material. The idea of a vice is it's a habit that leads to sadness, that leads away from happiness. A habit, so in order to understand a virtue or a vice, one has to understand what a habit is. And we often use that term habit in our culture to refer to some kind of semi-conscious, mechanical, thoughtless behavior. And that's not what we mean when we're using the term habit here in philosophy and in theology. Instead, what we mean is a settled disposition that makes you inclined to act in a certain way. A settled disposition that makes you inclined to act in a certain way. And what makes something a habit, especially, is that it's the idea of that settledness, settled disposition. It's not easily changed. It can be changed, but it can only be changed over time, and it's difficult to do so. A habit that leads to your flourishing is a virtue. A habit that leads to corruption, that leads away from happiness, is a vice. So there's a very highly developed understanding of each of these ideas: habit, act, virtue, vice, and so on. But I remember the first time I got into this treatment about what Thomas Aquinas calls the 7 capital vices. The 7 capital vices. If most people have never even heard of that phrase. Maybe they've heard of a close cousin called the 7 deadly sins. In some ways, that's kind of like a popularization of what St. Thomas has to say about the 7 capital vices. He prefers that terminology, 7 capital vices. So I want to explain what that is, and then give the imagery that is used throughout the Middle Ages about this idea of a tree, to understand this teaching on the 7 capital vices. And the whole objective here, as we talk about these vices, is to understand how to pursue happiness, and how what these vices are essentially counterfeit happinesses. They're counterfeits. They're not the real deal, but they appear to be. That's the key thing. They're not the real deal, but they appear to be, or they can appear to be. That's what makes them a counterfeit. So there's what St. Thomas, there's 2 streams of enumerating the capital vices. There's one that originates with, or at least goes back to, Pope St. Gregory the Great, where he lists pride as like the trunk of the tree, and then there's 7 branches that comes off the tree. And the 7 are vainglory, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, sometimes called wrath, and sloth. Most people, when they hear about the 7 deadly sins or 7 capital vices, vainglory drops out of the list, and in its place is pride. We don't want to dispute really about that list. We'll follow the list that Thomas does, which he himself gets from Gregory the Great. So there's really 8. There's 7 capital vices. Those are the branches of the tree, and they each come to the trunk, which is pride. And we'll explain the relationship on those things in just a second. But the idea, before we get into the trunk and the branches further, and then there are 44 daughters, which is a really fascinating treatment. But the idea is of a capital vice. We get the word capital, from the idea of head, source. It comes from the Latin word caput, which it just means head or source. So we have that come over into English, like in the capital of a state, the state's capital. There's a sense in which that's the source or the head for that society. And this is the reason why they're called the 7 capital vices. Some of these, Thomas specifically says, some of these are not mortal sins. Some of them are. Some can be one or the other. It's not that these vices are the worst, that they're the worst of all sins. It's that they are the mother of all other vices. They're the source of all the vices. They are the fountainhead that you can trace back individual vices back to those sort of mother vices. And this is the reason why it's useful to enumerate these things and to understand what they are, so that you can detect them in yourself, not in others, but in yourself. You can detect them in yourself. And there are remedies that are associated with each one of these that we can touch on briefly. But maybe I'll pause there. Michael, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I had a couple of things. One, could you repeat? So the trunk is pride, and you made the distinction between that and one of the branches, vainglory. Could you enumerate the 7 branches again?
Yeah, they're vainglory, greed, or avarice, sometimes it's called, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, and sloth. Sometimes anger is substituted for wrath. It's a Latin word, ire, I-R-A. We get our word irascible from it.
Okay.
Or ire, even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's important. I just to have a comment there, and then I'll go on to the second point I was going to make. Irascible. Some will remember that in a previous video we talked about the irascible appetite. Ryan referred to it as the fighting appetite, the fighting sense. And so there are things that should. It doesn't. This is not to say that anger is inherently bad. Ryan may have some comments on that. There are situations in which it's appropriate to be angry, and if we're not angry, something's wrong. If someone, there are things that should make us angry, and anger has a value, and it's a part of our nature. It just can also be disordered.
Right.
For those that are Catholic and went to Mass today, it's very fitting that the second reading was on the flesh versus the spirit, and the homilist today gave a homily on what the flesh is, and he talks about being dominated by the passions. It was a reading from Romans. Those are just a couple of small side comments, but one other. Now I lost the main other second point, so sorry about that. Any follow up on those things? Or
Yeah, my experience has been, when I first got into trying to understand St. Thomas's teaching on the 7 capital vices, how my experience was a sense of kind of bewilderment. Like, how could I have so misunderstood each of these? And I think it's in part because there's been a popularization and a twisting of what these are, so that, for example, sloth, which if we have time, we'll talk about later. Most people think that what that means is just like a physical laziness. Somebody's a sloth if they're lazy or slovenly, but St. Thomas believes that sloth, as insofar as it's a vice, a capital vice, it's not about physical laziness. It's about, basically, it's an internal resistance to the demands of love. That's what sloth is. So anybody who has experienced, coming to the appointed time for prayer, and you've experienced like about having to pray, that's sloth. It has a name, and it has daughter vices that are associated with it, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it has remedies that are associated with it. That's why this is useful. It's a diagnostic tool to help identify places in your life where you may be attached to a counterfeit good, and to be able to recognize that and fight against it, so that you can reorient your life, reorient the things that you love in the correct way, reorient those in the correct way. That's why this is useful. It's not about inducing shame. It's about helping speed repentance and movement back to the true good and the true source of light and life and happiness. So it has a structure, and people who are interested can Google paintings of the tree of vices, and there's these really ornate paintings in the Renaissance era that depict, everything's written in Latin, all the labels are in Latin, but the trunk is superbia, which is pride. And then you have a branch, let's say vainglory. What vainglory is an excessive desire that other people give you praise or glory. It's not a desire that people give you praise or glory. It's an excessive desire that people give you praise or glory. What pride is, insofar as it's a capital vice, it's an excessive desire for personal excellence. Not a desire for personal excellence. It's an excessive desire or an inordinate desire for personal excellence. And then this is why vainglory and pride are often lumped together, because they're very, very similar. Vainglory, again, is an excessive desire for the manifestation of one's personal excellence, or for people to give you accolades or praise, whether you deserve it or not. See, vainglory isn't just about, hey, I'm awesome, I did this great thing, everybody see it. That is vainglory. But a vainglorious person doesn't always care whether they deserve the honor and praise. They just want it. And so then I talked about these daughters, each branch, and when you look in these paintings, you'll see like each of the branches they're usually depicted as like leaves that come off the branch. You can think about them as like sub branches. And collectively across the 7 branches, there are 44 daughters. And I'll just list the daughters of vainglory for people to see. Vainglory, the daughters are disobedience, boasting, hypocrisy, strife, obstinacy, discord, and a love of novelty. So the idea, each one of those, they are themselves vices, things that I listed. A daughter, one of the 44 daughters, just is a vice, but it's downstream of the branch. Mixed metaphors here. It's downstream of the branch, which itself is downstream of the trunk. The life force that flows through the trunk and into the branch and then into the sub branch or leaf. The reason that's useful is because there are 2 orders in which all of these vices are related. It's the order of source, where pride is the origin, the source, that moves into a particular way in which one is that pride is engaged in, one of the 7 branches, which then itself moves into one of these daughters. So that's the order of source. But then there's another order, which is the really useful, I think, spiritual order, and that is the order of appearance. One will notice a daughter usually first, and then you can trace the daughter back to the branch, and then you can trace the branch, of course, back to the trunk. So the order of source goes trunk, branch, daughter, and then the order of appearance, or things that are more obvious to us, is in the reverse. So, for example, a person who there are many people who, anytime the latest, one of these comes out, they've got to have it. And it's not just that they have to have it, they have to let you know that they have it because they have a love of novelty, a love of new things. It's always about the newest, latest, wonderful thing. This could be this daughter that's indicated here, which itself is connected to vainglory, an excessive desire for praise and honor.
Ryan, can I mention that I don't want to interrupt your train of thought. You were going to talk. What I was going to mention was my second thought from earlier was related to pride and lust.
Mhm.
And lust is a common sin among men, a common vice. But ultimately, if you uh, there's an example. I think of it as an example of how you can see pride at the root. Um, if you end up in entering into an act of disobedience through lust, um, there Saint Augustine has this phrase that's drawn from Scripture about self-denial, about loving God to the point of despising yourself, or loving yourself to the point of despising God.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets at the root of love, where if we love God above all things, then that means at some points there may be things that we desire that we have to tell ourselves no to,
Right.
because a desire might be disordered. And with lust, you might desire, for example, beauty, the beauty of another person, the physical beauty of another person, and it's not your spouse. And or you're not married and some stranger immodestly dressed. But the reason that pride is at the root of that is you you recognize that that's wrong, and you you've got two choices. You can say, well, I'm going to do it anyways because I want it. That's where you can kind of see pride revealed at the root of it.
Right.
You can say, no, it's wrong, and I owe obedience to God. I must love Him above all things. He's the highest good, the source of all goods. And this is a disorder. It's a vice, and as a vice, it is not. It doesn't order me toward my end, the supreme good that I'm called to love above all things. And it dishonors Him. So sin does a couple of things. It both denigrates us as being made in the image of God, but it also is an affront to God. So so sin does both of those things, and we can tend to de-emphasize one or the other, but both of those are important. Really, the most important is what we owe to God. And pride, in the vice of pride, we can say, well, I want it, so that's what I'm going to do. I know it's wrong, I'm going to do it anyways. And that really gets at the root of how mortal sin can occur if it's a grave matter. Uh,
Mhm.
so anyways, those are just some thoughts
Yeah.
about pride
Um,
being at the root.
each of these, the most extended treatment that St. Thomas gives to the seven capital vices is in his book called De Malo, On Evil. And there are two English translations available of that book, of that treatise. And right now, the sort of the online repository for Thomas's works, aquinas.cc, it does not have either one of those, or any third English translation. If you go there, it just gives the Leonine Latin text. So I imagine they're working on a third Latin translation. But there are two very good ones out right now that goes into one. If anyone's ever read a disputed question that St. Thomas does, it's like whereas in the Summa, often St. Thomas will give what he takes to be the 2, 3, 4, rarely 5 best objections to his position. Disputed question lists 20 objections, and then the response section is very, very long. And he goes into great detail on there. And one of the things he says is there are two places in Scripture. One place where it speaks about covetousness is the root of all sins. So he says, well, what about that? Why isn't the trump covetousness? And another place, the love of money is the root of all evil. Well, what about that? Is that the trunk, right? And so the objectors, sort of raise these things. And what he says is, in every sin, remember, a vice is a settled disposition to engage in particular types of sin. In every sin, there is two things: a turning away from God and a turning toward some created good. It's important, turning toward a created good, because it's important. Remember, we talked about in a prior video that the will is a good-seeking missile. And so what happens when one sins is one chooses the action by focusing on the small part of good that is in it, and ignores the overall, evil of the action. And so what he says is the turning away from God is the pride, and the turning toward a created good is covetousness. And since every sin has both components, we can say that in one sense, pride is the root of all of the sins and all the vices, and in a certain sense, covetousness is the root, in a different respect. But he summarizes, he finishes that part of De Malo by saying every vices can be distinguished based on what it is that they're attracted to or repulsed from. A vice attracts you to some particular good, or, and this is important, makes you flee from some difficulty in obtaining a good. And that's why, for example, sloth is so poorly understood, because what sloth is a fleeing from the difficulty of obtaining a particular good. And in this case, it's loving people whom God has called you to love and serve. And you can see sometimes the difficulty in that. When, let's say, you've done something you need to apologize for, and it's a long walk down the hall to apologize, and it feels like death because that part of you wants to flee from the difficulty in and accepting responsibility for what you've done and asking forgiveness for it. That hurts. But Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, narrow is the gate that leads to life. Narrow.
Right.
It feels like narrow, meaning really small. You got to squeeze through it, and it feels like you're going to get squished. But the paradox is that in some cases, in order to truly live, you have to, as you said, Michael, reject certain things that you think you want. You die to live. That's the secret of the gospel. And these 7 capital vices are particular ways in which we try to get life, or we avoid difficulties because we think we'll be better off since we avoided it. And when you understand what these things are, then you can see them in yourself, and you can start to go to war against them. These little parts of yourself that, in your best moments, you don't really want, and you recognize that there are things that keep you from your true good. Well, these things have a name. Let me give one more example as we kind of probably round out our time here, and that's envy. The term envy today has a popular meaning that's not what St. Thomas means by it. I said sloth is an example of that. Envy is also an example of that. We use the word envy very loosely to say, oh man, I'm really envious of that vacation you just took. And when what we mean is, I would like to take a vacation like that. I'm really envious of the job you just got. When what we mean is, I would like to have a job like that. That's not what envy means in this context. When Thomas uses the term envy in reference to these capital vices, he means sorrow over another person's good. And we could put it very concretely. Envy is what you see when a child hasn't played with a toy in a year, and then a sibling comes along and picks up that toy to play with it. And now all of a sudden that first child is like, have to have the toy right now. That's envy. And the way envy functions is it's not just that I want to have the thing. That's not really what makes how envy functions. It's that I don't want you to have it. I will feel happy if you are deprived of a good. Terribly destructive.
Right. And when you state it that way, you see how evil it is.
Yeah.
But you're calling it what it is. And that's something you mentioned early, being able to name things, to go to war with them. There's a spiritual principle that's manifested in the Gospels associated with demonic possession and casting out demons, is naming the demon. And that, as I understand it, in exorcisms, that's important. And this is, of course, not exorcisms, but it is a spiritual fight. It is a spiritual battle. and being able to name something for what it is. One of the ways that things get rooted in us, and Ryan was alluding to this earlier, but one of the ways that things get rooted in us is we give them nice names. We give things, we don't accurately name them. And we can see this in our society. These are examples of this, that calling abortion healthcare, calling things rights that are not rights. There's a lot of confusion over terms, calling things that are not love, love. So if we misname things, if we don't name a thing according to what they are, it's a form of self-deception. So it's really important to name things accurately in terms of what they are. So that's really helpful in naming the vices, the 7 vices, knowing what they are.
Yeah. So maybe in future videos we can talk more about a few of these and recommend resources for those who might be interested in diving deeper on these topics. But as we conclude, I just want to mention a few remedies, because I said at the beginning that the purpose of this kind of study and being able to identify the 7 capital vices and their daughters and so on, the purpose is not to make people feel bad. It's not to increase someone's shame. The purpose is to help us identify things that are like leeches on happiness, like that are sucking away our energy to pursue genuine fulfillment in this life and the next. And so that's why anytime these capital vices are discussed, they're usually accompanied by remedies. Let me give an example of remedies for envy. One remedy for envy, especially envy typically comes up to people you don't like, or people whom you have a grievance against, and you don't want to see them succeed, right? You don't want to see them get a promotion. You don't want to whatever. One of the remedies for this is to pray for them. Mm-hmm. Because in the praying for them, and you are, right, Jesus talks about praying for your enemies. In praying for them, you're cutting at the root of envy, which is this happiness at seeing someone deprived of a good. So a remedy for envy is praying for them. Another remedy is generosity. Because the idea of envy is, I don't want you to have a good. Generosity, giving away, also cuts at the root of that. An example of a remedy for sloth, remember, laziness about love. That's what that is. An example of a remedy for that is fasting. In some form of it, because in doing that, what you're doing is you are gaining greater mastery over your this internal like inclinations, and you're gaining a greater mastery over that. And of course, these are things, these kind of basic spiritual practices that Jesus speaks about often. Prayer, especially for those who persecute you or who have wronged you. Fasting, giving away, right? This is key. Matthew chapter 6, Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, I want you to pray, but don't do it like the Pharisees do. How do they do it? They do it vaingloriously. They stand on the corner and they announce, they speak very loudly so everyone can hear them, so they can say, oh, wow, look how great they are, right? They do it vaingloriously. But I don't want you to do that. He says, I want you to pray, but I want you to do it in secret, right? I want you to do it. And what he's saying is not, obviously we pray corporately together in public. He's saying, I want you to do it without being vainglorious. I want you to do it so that it's not possible for people to look and go, oh, wow, look at that guy's prayer life. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Same thing about giving. He says, I want you to give. The Pharisees give. I want you to give too, but don't do it like they do. How do they do it? They do it vaingloriously. Mm-hmm. He says they give and they announce that they've given. They want everyone to know, what they've given. And Jesus says, do it. You give, but do it so your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing, which is an idiom that means do it without being self-conscious. Mm-hmm. So Pharisees are other conscious when they give. I want you to do it without being self-conscious. Just you're not doing it, but, oh, should I do, is this the right, you overflow. It's reflexive virtue. So the way ultimately that you conquer any of these capital sins is by a greater love, and reorienting the love to the Lord, which is ultimately the only thing that can help root out these tendencies that we have that rob us of our vitality in this life.
You could really see that with envy too, it being disordered in terms of not willing the good of your neighbor, being sad at the good of your neighbor, and how that's so contrary to love, to loving them and praying for them. You're willing their good, and it may be a material good, but ultimately if you're willing their good in an ultimate sense, in the sense of charity, you're willing for their eternal happiness. You're willing for them to be united to God. And that's a universal goodwill, something that we should will for all people, is us desiring all mankind to be in union with God, to know him, to love him, to serve him, and in that to find eternal happiness.
Yep.
Super, super helpful. Something maybe we could do in future videos. This would be a really comprehensive theological topic, but I think it raises a lot of questions for people today. It did when I first heard it. The principle that our love is ordered toward good in a fundamental sense, and we don't love things that are evil. And this makes sense of God creating everything good, and ask the question of how could, but then it raises theological questions about, like, Adam and Eve, how could they choose evil if evil was not an existing thing? And the idea that there is some good in all people, and raises questions about, like, was there good in Satan? And the answer is yeah, there's the good of existence, that at least at the very least, he is being sustained in existence by the mercy of God, and the justice of God is reflected in that his punishment as an angel that is chosen evil is eternal. But there are a lot of theological and philosophical questions associated with this idea of our will being fundamentally oriented toward good, but our even particular choices. And I have questions that maybe you have some thoughts on, and in a future video we could talk about what malice is, like a choice that is malicious, and how that relates to good and evil. So those may be some things that we might talk about in future videos too. Any other thoughts to kind of wrap a bow on things? Or
no, I think we've covered it today.
Okay. I hope everyone has enjoyed the video. This is a joy for us, and I hope that it's useful for everyone that watches, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone in the next video. Please, if you watch it and you enjoy the video, please subscribe, like the video, and subscribe to the channel, and also feel free to add comments, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone in the next video.